I think as we get started, I'm curious. I asked last week how many of you have read wisdom literature stuff in the past and what it's meant to you. But I'm thinking specifically about Job. Have any of you spent any time in Job? Yeah. Ramon, what's your impression of Job?
I think whether we like it or not, Job is telling us about life, you know, and that's what life is. And in many ways, you know, whether we like it or not, we go through a lot of hard times. And it's like, you know, who did that? You know, whether it was the hen or the chicken. I mean, is God present through us and with us? That doesn't mean we're not going to go through some stuff, whether it is disease or whether it is this, you know, any type of dysfunctions. And some of that are quite beyond our control. And but God prevailed. And in that sense, God is not done yet.
Yeah. Anyone else? I will say, oh, go ahead, Heather.
Well, I really liked Job when we studied it, and I used a book called Splendor of His Ways to help me understand. And it was fantastic in understanding that it's all about God maturing Job.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's oh, hello, Kat. I'm pro Kat. Very good. Melissa, I love you. Fantastic. Yeah, no, that's great. And there's a million takes on Job and kind of what the message is. I'm going to present one that a lot of people look at it as, and then I'm going to present what I think it is, somewhat in light of that, and we'll talk about it. I'll say this up front. This is one of the more difficult books to read. If you just pick it up, Ecclesiastes is hard, but Ecclesiastes has the benefit of being 12 chapters. Like, even if it's hard, it's not that long. Whereas Job is hard and it's 42 chapters. And so it can be really tough. The first 2 chapters are easy, and I would say the last chapter is relatively easy. Everything else can be really difficult. So if you ever try and find yourself, you want to go through it in your own personal worship or prayer time, and you get stuck, you're not alone. Don't feel too bad about it. You know, pick up some supplemental reading to get through it. And hopefully you'll find this helpful. And in the handout, I've got suggestions on how I think you should read it, like what you should focus on, maybe ways to think through things, because especially when you're reading Hebrew poetry, you can just get lost sometimes and just kind of go, I don't know what these people are talking about anymore. And just having even a 1-sentence framework in the back of your mind can help. So let's see, I'll go ahead and share here. Oops. And here we go. So again, we're in the Bible's Books of Wisdom. This is the second evening, and we're in the book of Job tonight. And I really want to start off basically reviewing the Retribution Principle. And the reason I want to start here is because in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, the book of Proverbs falls immediately before the book of Job. It's the very first book before that. And my personal take on it is that's almost intentional, that you're supposed to read one followed by the other and kind of see them back to back. And Proverbs, as we talked about last time, pretty much promotes an ideal, the way we want the world to work, the way it ought to work, right? You have wisdom, goodness, righteousness, justice, all of these beautiful things that we want on one side, and you have folly, wickedness, selfishness, injustice, sinfulness, all this other stuff on the other. And you want it to work out that those who are wise get blessed, that they end up with long lives, with wealth, with promised land, with wonderful families. And you want those who are wicked and evil and foolish to end up cursed. We don't want wicked people living long lives. We don't want them, you know, excelling and being the wealthy and all of this. And so Proverbs kind of sets you up that this is the way the world ought to work. And in many cases it does. And you can use some extreme examples. For the most part, you know, say those who languish for years and are obstinate, not that they can't for health reasons, but they're obstinate in their substance abuse. A lot of times you see this, families fall apart. They end up in poverty, their body ends up sick and things like that. And those typically who say avoid smoking tend to live longer lives. Tend to. Not all the time, but tend to, right? You kind of see where it's going through. So it's like this is the ideal and what it ought to be here. The book of Job presents us with what's often called Theodicy. And kind of what happens, as Ramon was saying, is what happens when you get to the real world here and you actually deal with the way things actually work. And you see that, it's not always nice and neat like that. And we see horrible people prosper. We see really good people get abused, taken advantage of, and end up in poverty. And it's heartbreaking. And of course, I'm sure we've all asked this question. Why does bad stuff happen to good people, right? That's the whole question of theodicy. In short, theodicy is the vindication of God in the light of evil in the world. And people have presented this topic in a variety of different questions, right? Is God all good, but not all powerful? Or is God all powerful, but not all good? Because you would expect that if God is both all good and all powerful, we shouldn't have evil in the world. Because if he's all good, he shouldn't want there to be evil and suffering. So maybe he's not all powerful. He would like to stop it. He's just not strong enough. Or maybe he's strong enough to stop it, but he doesn't care enough about us, so he's not all good. You see the dilemma? Yeah, and so one of the questions that comes out of this, and I would say Christianity and Judaism both, and many other religions will say, no, absolutely, God is both good and powerful, but we've got to make sense of this in some way. And theodicy attempts to answer these questions and attempts to approach it in different ways. And so its goal is it's asking these questions and presenting whether it's philosophy, theology, religious texts, personal experience, whatever it happens to be, will approach this and try and answer these questions. And many people try and approach Job like this and say it's possibly a theodicy. And as we go through and we see the suffering of Job, hopefully we'll get a sense of why there's evil in the world and why somebody good like Job would suffer so horribly. So it more or less sets it up like this, is as you start with the retribution principle, it's basically, why does this happen? Why is it that somebody who's wise and good, righteous and just, why do they end up in such misery, in such suffering and poverty and all of this? Does this make sense? Seeing some nods, so we'll go with that. So again, a lot of people approach the book of Job hoping to get this type of answer. As I go through, I'll give you kind of the spoiler alert ahead of time. I am not fully convinced that this is what Job is trying to do. And we'll talk about why I think that later on. Now, you can easily come to a different conclusion on this. And if you do, that's great. Send me an email. If you live in my area, let's have coffee or something. That'd be a lot of fun. And if you're in California and we can have coffee next time I'm out there, let's do it. That'd be a lot of fun too. Turning to the book of Job itself then, authorship and date here. I'm not going to read through all of these. The big point here is we have no idea where this book came from. It doesn't just seem to appear, but there's no attribution. I would say most scholars nowadays think there's probably two authors. As I'll show on the next slide, there's both poetry and prose. There's prose at the beginning, there's prose at the end, and the majority of the book is written in poetry. And many think that it developed either by two authors or over time at two different periods in time, and that either the poetry was added to the prose or the prose added to the poetry, as it might be. Rabbis from the 1st and 2nd century Common Era put it anywhere from the time of Moses or even earlier with Abraham, all the way to the post-exilic period. So, I mean, we're talking like this thing could have been written anywhere within 1,500 years, right? And you put that back into perspective today, we're talking about what, like 600 CE in modern times? Like we're in the middle of the Roman Empire, right? It could have been written anywhere from the Roman Empire to the internet age. That's a huge span of time. It's likely written after Proverbs, and I think my argument for that is because of its emphasis on the retribution principle, because it's going to show up quite a bit throughout the book of Job. Ezekiel, a prophet that's written during the time of the exile, lists Job among Daniel and Noah as being somebody worth emulating. And so it's quite possible that this Job is well known then. And so that kind of gives us a late date for it, as maybe exile, early post-exile, something like that. Those that study Hebrew language a lot better than I do date it around the 6th century BCE. But like I said, the short answer is we're not 100% sure, and it's complicated. So how's that for a good scholarly answer? And by the way, if you ever come across something in a commentary or whatever, and it says something along the lines of, there are multiple perspectives on this, that's basically shorthand for, I have no idea. I'm going to give you my best guess as we go through, but the answers for this are all over the place. Structure of the book is a bit more straightforward than Proverbs, which actually helps quite a bit. The book starts with a prologue that introduces us to Job in just the first 5 verses, and then it really gets into what I call 2 wagers with the Satan. And I'll explain why I have the at the beginning of that in a little bit. But it starts off with this, and we see Job goes through horrible things. And then Job does kind of what you would expect him to do, to cry out in lament. He curses the day of his birth. He laments the fact that he's been born at all, and he just wallows in agony in the midst of this. He has 3 friends that show up, and they engage in dialogue with him in an honest attempt to help him. As we'll go through, we'll see that their speeches come across as rather cold, but it's intended to be helpful. It's not intended to be cold. It's really intended to help. And it goes back and forth. One of them speaks, then Job, and it keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And then in the middle of all this, it gets interrupted with a poem about wisdom. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Then Job makes some oaths and gives his final speech. Then we get a 4th friend who kind of rebukes the other ones and says, that's it, you guys are a bunch of idiots. What you need is a real master of this thing. I'm here, Elihu to the rescue. And he adds almost nothing to the conversation. So we're not going to talk about him tonight. I got enough stuff to cover. God finally shows up in chapter 38, and he more or less lets Job have it, as we'll see. As you can well imagine, any kind of conversation that you want to have with the Almighty is quite possibly not going to go fully in your favor. And there's some great stuff here in really getting into the theology of the book and what's going on. But then the book does eventually have a happy ending when Job is restored at the end, and a lot of his fortunes come back and his family and things like that. So like I said, the book is set up with like this prose framework with all this poetry in the middle. And that bottom thing there where it says Job restored, it should be Job 42, 7 through 17, not Job 4. I'm an idiot, I apologize. But you have this prose and this poetry. And so like I said, as many people think that the prose was probably written first. And so you have this nice little story. And if you read Job chapters 1 through 2, and then jump down to Job chapter 42, verse 7, you almost have a coherent story just by itself. There's some stuff that won't make sense, perhaps when God starts rebuking the friends, because they haven't said anything at that point. So what's God rebuking? But otherwise, the story more or less makes sense. And so some people, a lot of scholars think that the poetry was added second as a way to kind of flesh out the story. My personal take on this, and it's a minority opinion, is that if it was written that way, where you have the prose and poetry coming in at opposite times, is that it would be the other way around. And the reason is because the poetry, a lot of things in antiquity exist as poetry. The Hebrew Bible is one of the few, if not the only ancient text that tells narrative in prose. So if you think back to your high school days when you may have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's all poetry. And that's more common in antiquity than prose. So what we get in the Bible in books like Genesis, Exodus, and so on is very rare in antiquity. And so it's quite possible that the poetry would have existed first, and then you add the prose to it to explain what the poetry means. But again, that's my view. That's not the majority view. I think if you read any of the books I've recommended, it's going to tell you exactly the opposite of just what I said. they do better work than me. If you believe them, that's totally fine. You're in good company there. And it's quite possible one person sat down and wrote this whole story. That's entirely possible. I don't see any reason to suggest it couldn't have been. But that throws some stuff out there. All right, so that's some of the mechanics and academic type stuff here. Are there questions at this point? Again, this is why you all come for this, is for outlines, I'm sure. That's the exciting stuff of biblical studies, is to get bulleted points. So let's talk about Job himself. And originally I did have the text up here. This is the first 5 verses of the book. So Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And as you come up, if God was ever to write a story about me, and anybody is ever going to put my life on paper, I would love it if they would start it off the way that they start off with Job. There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned from evil. That's a great introduction. Love it. This is a good guy. You love this guy. And as you go through the story, it says, when feast days would come and run their course, Job would send and sanctify his own children. He would get up early in the morning, offer burnt sacrifices according to the number of all of his children. For Job said, "It might be that my children have sinned. Maybe they've cursed God in their hearts." And this is what Job always did. So he's making sacrifices and offerings for the sake of his own children, just in case they've sinned and done something stupid in the middle of a party. Any of us, remember our college years, have teenagers, it's possible they do something stupid at a party. Unlikely, of course, but possible. So his character is presented as amazing, and then his family and possessions are about as perfect as you could possibly get. In verse 2, it says there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. And it almost feels like, from what we studied last time with the retribution principle and what we got in Proverbs, that there should be a therefore at the beginning of verse 2. So this man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned from evil. Therefore, there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters, and so on. It doesn't say that, but it almost feels like it should. He's got the perfect number of sons. He's got 3 daughters. His family's going to exist for years and years and years. He's got all of this stuff. And so he's basically presented as the epitome of what a Proverbs man ought to be, both in what he looks like, how he acts, and also in what he has. And therefore, it is absolute nonsense to think that anything bad should happen to this man. This man, it should basically be these first 5 verses, and then it should end with, and he lived happily ever after. Short story, maybe a little fun when you tell your kids at bedtime. That's how the story ought to go. Does this make sense? Then you have one of the most interesting scenes in all of Scripture. The sons of God come and they meet with Yahweh. They meet with the Lord. Who these sons of God are, not entirely clear. Perhaps some kind of divine council, an angelic meeting where God's bringing his heavenly host together to meet with them. And Yahweh approaches the Satan, or the accuser. And I'm sure we all read Hebrew, so those letters on the screen mean something deep to you all. But that character all the way on your right is Ha. It's pronounced Ha, and it means the. And the other 3 letters to the left there are pronounced Satan. So you'd pronounce this going right to left in Hebrew, Ha Satan, the Satan. And so this is not Satan as you would typically conceive him from a Christian perspective, with his pitchfork and red skin and pointy tail and horns on his head, that type of thing. The word means accuser. The word Satan at its base means accuser. And so this particular character is just the accuser that God himself approaches, which is rather important here. The Lord says to Satan, where have you come from? And the Satan answered the Lord, oh, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking all up and down it. And then I love this. Have you considered my servant Job? God asks this question. And I can think of like a proud father at the end of a Little League game where his son just hit the game-winning home run at the bottom of the 6th inning to finally send his team into the playoffs or to win the championship. And he's standing there and he's got his arm around his son saying, that's my boy. You seen my boy? He's the one who hit the home run. This is my boy. The Satan, you seen this guy? That's my boy. I'm proud of him. Right? Have you considered my servant Job? This is my guy. This is what everybody should be like. And the Satan responds and he says, well, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has. Then Job will curse you to your face. This is the wager. Let's touch Job, get rid of all of his stuff, and then he'll curse you. The only reason that Job worships you, God, is because of all the blessings and things you've given him. You take it all away, he'll reject you, he'll curse you. And so God says, that's it. Very well. All that he has is in your power. Only don't stretch out your hand against him. So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Do whatever you want to him, but you can't touch Job himself. So what happens? 4 messengers come to Job one day shortly thereafter. The first one comes and says, the Sabaeans, they stole your oxen and your donkeys, and they killed your servants. Only I have escaped to tell you. Then while that one's still speaking, another messenger comes and says, oh, my master, fire came down from heaven, consumed your sheep and your servants, and only I have escaped to tell you. While that one's still speaking, a third messenger comes and says, the Chaldeans, they stole your camels and they killed your servants, and only I have escaped to tell you. And as you've picked up the pattern, while that one's still speaking, the fourth shows up and says, look, all your children were gathered together in your eldest son's house, and while they were there, a great wind came, knocked over the house, and all your children are dead. Only I have escaped to tell you. This is a bad day. This is a really, really bad day. You thought you had a bad day? This is a bad day. Everything he has, everything that was set up in the first part of the book is now gone. All taken away, presumably in one afternoon. The Satan has had his way with Job here. And how does Job respond? Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshiped. Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. In the King James, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And of course, this is how I would react instinctively in such a situation. Absolutely not. This is crazy. Who reacts like this? But he sees all of this stuff as coming from God. And so in all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing in any way. He maintains his integrity, and the Satan has lost round 1 of the wager. And there's another wager. And it starts up exactly the same as it did before. The sons of God come to meet with Yahweh. Yahweh approaches the Satan and does the same thing. You seen my servant Job? That's my boy. I'm proud of my boy. You see the way he took that last thing? He still is upright. He says, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And he still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him, for no reason. Yahweh himself admits here two things. One is that Job is indeed the man of integrity that the first 5 verses set Job up to be. He agrees with the narrator here. Second, he admits that this affliction that's come upon Job has happened for no reason. It's all this wager between Yahweh and the Satan, and it's rather interesting that this starts off with Yahweh both times. Yahweh initiates the conversation. So this time, the accuser, the Satan, he comes back with a different wager. And he says, look, Job only worships you again because of the blessings, but it's the blessings of your health. It's because he's fine. Skin for skin, all that people have, they will give to save their own lives. But stretch out your hand now, touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. So Yahweh said to the Satan, very well, he's in your power, only spare his life. So now the leash is let out a little bit, and the accuser is given more opportunity to afflict Job, this time not on his stuff, all that's been taken away, but on Job's body itself. And so Job is afflicted and left in agony. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job then took a potsherd with which to scrape himself, and he sat among the ashes. And the agony is so bad, he's trying to scrape the sores off his body. He's in absolute misery. His wife then comes to him and offers him great comfort here. His wife said to him, why do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. Just get it over with. Curse God and die. But again, Job says, you speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not also receive the bad? Some translations might say, should we receive good and not also evil? And evil in the Hebrew culture was conceived as like anything unpleasant, from being attacked by demons to stubbing your toe on the ottoman. Any of those things could be considered a greater or lesser evil, so that would make sense. And so once again, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. This is a man of integrity, a man who is sincere in his worship of God, and he is set up perfectly. So I put here the evolving description of Job. It really should be the devolving description of Job. All of his stuff that he had at the beginning is gone. Oxen and donkeys stolen, sheep burned, camels stolen, servants dead. It's all gone. And his family, his sons and daughters have been brutally killed, tragically killed. Job begins this whole story as the epitome of wisdom, of a wise man. And like I said, he's the epitome of what a Proverbs man ought to look like, both in who he is and in his integrity and his character, but also in what he has. By the end of chapter 2, he ends as the epitome of a cursed person. This book has really set up the opposite extremes. And we do this all the time in politics, right? When you're trying to talk to somebody about any particular issue, and I'm not going to list them because that can get us off track, but you kind of take an extreme and say, well, you hold this position. What about this situation? How would you react there? And it's kind of try to show the folly of what's being said or to put them on their heels or whatever. And here it's kind of doing that. If you're going to hold to the retribution principle, we have now taken the total opposite extremes. The perfectly wise and righteous person ends up with the most horrid curse imaginable. Does this make sense? I'm going to pause for questions, both from you, but also I've got a few to ask of you. But are there questions on your end? I'm not hearing any. Am I missing any hands? All right, so my questions for you, and do feel free to just shout them out or unmute yourselves. If you were Job at this point, the next thing that happens is Job's friends show up. You're in the midst of all of this. What do you want your friends to do to help you? Or what do you want them not to do? Yeah, Ramon.
I don't want them to argue or to reason or to try to come up with explanation. And most of the time, that's what we do. I
Yeah.
just would like them to be somewhat, caring or full body presence and to be a good listener.
Yeah.
But I recognize that that's not what we usually do.
Yeah, I would echo Ramon. I think you want your friends to be supportive no matter what your situation is.
Yeah, supportive, listening, caring. All of that's very good. Yeah, excellent. Excellent. If you were Job, what would you say to God?
What are you doing to me? And why are you doing this to me?
Yeah.
Are you really there? Are you really behind me?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I kind of want to be the devil advocate in the sense that for me, I live a lot with a God in process and a God who is becoming, and being as a co-creator. And in that sense, for me, I still God can be all good, but not all powerful. Then life has a lot of contradiction, and I don't mean I don't question, but I'm also much more free to question, but that doesn't necessarily, I don't know, it's like God used the health insurance, but God also used miracles.
Yeah, fair enough. Going back to the question of like, what are you doing or whatever, one of my professors in seminary had some quite discomforting stomach ailments that derailed him in a variety of things. And he had some other ailments too. And he ended up rather incapacitated towards the end of his life and then passed away, unfortunately. Wonderful, wonderful human being. And I hadn't had him for a semester or two. I saw him on campus and I went up and like, Dr. Kick, I just want to let you know I've been praying for you. And he looked me dead in the eyes and he goes, if this is what happens when you pray, stop it. And it's like, at some point you just kind of want to go, God, knock it off, whatever's happening. And I'm sure we've all said that at some point in our life, in the midst of whether it's great suffering or minor suffering, God, knock it off, leave me alone, go visit somebody else for a little while. Okay, so turning back here to Job's friends, as we jump back in, Job's friends finally show up. They come and they show up in what I would say is a real beautiful kind of desire to help. They want to console and comfort this man. They lift up their own voices and they weep with him. They tear their clothes, they throw dust on their heads, and they sit in silence for 7 days down there with Job. And I love this picture. I wish it wasn't quite as pixelated, but you see this anguishing, suffering man surrounded by people who are just looking on in sympathy and possibly empathy, but how can you possibly have empathy for someone who's suffering so deeply? I am personally quite moved with what they do here. I'll tell two stories. One's real and one's fictional. One of my old pastors was in Georgia, and a prominent member of their church, he drowned in his own pool. His wife comes home and finds her husband floating in the backdoor pool. Calls, my pastor, obviously in hysterics and all this. My pastor says, I'll be right over there. You just hold on. Then my pastor turns to his wife and says, Lynn, hop in the car with me. Let's go visit the widow together. And Lynn's like, I don't know what to say to this woman. I have no idea what she's going through. How am I supposed to possibly be helpful? She finally is convinced to go. They go to the house. She gets out of the car. She embraces the widow, and the two of them sob for the better part of an hour. No words exchanged, no advice, no explanation. They just cried together for an hour. And when the pastor and his wife were moving on to God's next calling and they did the goodbye party, That widow said that 45 minutes to an hour was the most meaningful time that she had ever experienced in their ministry, and how deeply moved and appreciative she was that Lynn would just come out and cry with her. And that's it. I love that story. Another one comes from A.A. Milne about Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. They go to visit Eeyore because they hadn't seen him in a while and they wanted to make sure if he was okay. And Eeyore says, "Am I okay? Well, I don't know, to be honest. Are any of us really okay? That's what I ask myself. And all I can tell you, Pooh and Piglet, is that right now I feel rather sad and alone and not much fun to be around at all. Which is why I haven't bothered you. Because you wouldn't want to waste your time hanging out with someone who is sad and alone and not much fun to be around at all, would you now?" Pooh looked at Piglet and Piglet looked at Pooh, and they both sat down, one on either side of Eeyore in his stick house. Eeyore looked at them in surprise. "What are you doing?" "We're sitting here with you because we are your friends. And true friends don't care if someone is feeling sad or alone or not much fun to be around at all. True friends are there with you anyway, and so here we are." "Oh," said Eeyore. "Oh." And the three of them sat there in silence, and while Pooh and Piglet said nothing at all, somehow, almost imperceptibly, Eeyore started to feel a very tiny little bit better. Because Pooh and Piglet were there, no more, no less. I almost get teary-eyed just reading that. That's beautiful, just to be there in solidarity with someone in the midst of great distress. Just to be there. I love this opening to the three friends. And then they open their mouths. And it goes downhill quite quickly from there. Right after the friends get there, Job laments his birth and the day of his birth and basically his whole life. Then the three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they take turns speaking, with Job responding after each one. The three friends reinforce the retribution principle. So remember, the wise and the good should get blessings, the wicked and the foolish should get curses, and you can probably see where this is going. Their perspective, however, is presented honestly and without caricature. And like I said, they're trying to be helpful. And you can almost see this as being like an intervention for somebody that we would see as being in trouble. You know, "Dave, you've really got to stop the drinking. This has gotten out of hand. All of these problems you're experiencing is because of your drinking. And if you can stop that, maybe we can get, your mortgage back on track, find you a better job, restore your marriage," all these types of things. I mean, it's a desire to actually help. Problem is Job knows that he's innocent. And so the more they talk, the more frustrated Job gets, and it kind of spirals downhill. The first two cycles of this, there's three cycles of, Eliphaz speaks, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar, Job. Cycle 2, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar, Job. In the third one, it starts to break down. Eliphaz gets a full speech, then Job. Bildad only gets 6 verses in this last one, and Zophar doesn't get to speak at all. And so it really seems to break apart and fall apart here. The big summary of the whole thing is it really is kind of repetitive, but it does progress a bit. And I think it's McLaughlin that I've quoted before. He basically says, this is actually the book that Ramon had. This is, I think, Valentine. He says, God vindicates and restores the innocent. That's more or less the summary of the first cycle. In the second cycle, they more or less say God punishes the guilty, with the implication that Job must be guilty of something. And then finally, Job suffers, so he must have sinned. That's more or less how you would summarize the third cycle. Then, like I said, in chapters 32 through 37, you get Elihu. We're not going to talk about him too terribly much, mainly because he doesn't add too terribly much there. To get a sense of the compassion of these three people once they start speaking, here's some of the stuff they actually say. Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright ever cut off? Again, Job has been cut off and he's perishing. The implication, you must have done something wrong. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert the right? Look, if iniquity is in your hand, just put it away, and then you will be able to lift your face without blemish. Come to your senses, cast off whatever it is that you did wrong that got you here. Just get rid of it, and you'll feel better. Things will go better for you. Are you the firstborn of the human race? Were you brought forth from the hills? Have you listened to the whole counsel of God, or do you limit wisdom to yourself? Are you wise in your own eyes, Job? Do you think you're above everyone else here? What makes you so special to think that you would suffer and not be guilty of some wrongdoing? Is it for your piety that God reproves you and enters into judgment with you? Is not your wickedness great? There is no end to your iniquities. How many of y'all keeping these friends around?
But sometimes they are difficult to kill.
My goodness, this is tough. And again, bringing up our chart here, you've got what ought to be with those arrows that should go from left to right. But then the problem is that Job suffers. So the only conclusion you can come up to is that he must have sinned. It must have happened this way. Now, I'm a former mathematician, so there's actually logic problems with this, which we're not going to get into. But you can see where they're going. They see Job suffering over here, therefore he must have sinned. That must have happened. So let's get to the bottom of it and see what's going on here. Job, of course, has things to say here, and he's got lots to say. And the big thing is throughout the whole thing, he maintains his innocence. He knows that he's done nothing wrong, and so he agrees with what God says that we already read. God has afflicted him for no reason. It's not because of some sin that he's committed. This is happening for no reason, and therefore, God must have actually perverted justice. Somewhere along the line, the just thing that should happen, good people get rewarded, bad people get punished. Somewhere along the line, God's messed it up. And the world is now morally chaotic. And the only thing that equalizes anything is death itself, right? And as we'll see in Ecclesiastes next week, if you're righteous, you die. If you're wicked, you die. Everybody dies. What difference does it make? Is kind of where Job ends up in the middle of this. Always the optimist, of course. So then he mocks them and their wisdom. And he's actually quite funny here. He calls them miserable comforters. I could also talk as you do if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head. I could encourage you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would assuage your pain. If I speak, I mean, it's all like sarcasm and mockery. Oh, you have so many words to speak. You clearly have all the solutions, right? And this is the whole thing, you know, and whatever it is people who talk too much, try and explain things, whatever it is, it's like the more they talk, the worse it gets. So what Job ultimately wants to do is to make his case before God directly. If God would only show up, I'd make my case to him, I'd show him all the evidence, and surely he would vindicate me. I want to take God to court and let him be basically the defendant and the judge, and I will win because I've done nothing wrong. And then finally, Job makes a lengthy speech in chapters 29 to 31, making particular oaths, some more laments, and various things like that. Any questions with the 3 cycles here? And as you can see, it's these speeches and these dialogues back and forth that take up the majority of the book. So I've spent most of my time in the first 2 chapters, and I'll spend a quite bit in the last 3 or 4. The majority of the book is these 3-4 slides that I've summarized here. The speeches get interrupted in chapter 28 with a poem on wisdom that really seems to come out of nowhere. So we're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to speed through this a bit. But basically, it shows that wisdom is more valuable than gold, pearls, chrysolite, crystal, but nobody can find it. Miners can probe the depths of the earth. They can search out hidden things, but wisdom itself is elusive. Nobody knows where it is. You know, we could see this maybe with our microbiologists, our physicists, and our astronomers. They can probe the farthest reaches of space. They can go where no man has ever gone before. They can't find wisdom. Where is it? Only God can find it. And God found it when he created the heavens and the earth and did all of these things. And what's interesting about this is if you read Proverbs chapter 8, followed by Job 28, you almost get directly opposing viewpoints here. Because wisdom in Proverbs 8 stands on the street corner and basically invites everybody to come meet her, to sit down and talk with her. She's shouting at you. But here in Job 28, wisdom is elusive. And there are all sorts of articles written about who's speaking here. Is it the narrator? Is it Job? Is it Zophar, who didn't get to speak at all? What's going on? And again, quite honestly, we're not 100% sure. Then we have Elihu, and then finally we get to the moment we've all been waiting for. God finally shows up. We finally get God. And what we want God to do is say, Job, I'm so sorry for all the pain you've been caused. Let me tell you about these wagers. I'm going to fix everything. You'll get your sons and daughters back. You'll get your stuff back. Thank you for being faithful. Well done, my good and faithful servant. That's what we want. That's not what we get. What we get is God says, who is this that darkens my counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you. You shall declare to me. Job had demanded an audience with God so that he could make his case to God and hear God's answer, and God flips the tables. You answer me. And he starts throwing out all of these questions. Where were you when I did this? Did you command the heavens and the earth to come forward? Who has done these great things? Can you control the cattle? Can you show them where to go? Do you know how these things were formed or how they work? It's all these questions pointing out Job's limits. Job is a finite person. His perspective and scope is small. He has no power in cosmology, in meteorology, in zoology, or anything else. He's just limited. And so for him to think that he's got everything under control and knows what's happening here, that's a mind too. He's thinking outside, way above himself. And so God ends his speech saying, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues with God must respond. I would plead the fifth at this point, I think. I'm not sure I want this conversation here with God. And so what's Job say? I see I'm small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. I've spoken once. I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further. He's been humbled. He's kind of been put in his place here, and so he refuses to talk. God, however, keeps going. And he starts more or less the same way. Gird up your loins. Be a man. I'll question you. You declare to me. Will you put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? And if you go through Job's speeches and things, he never comes out and says what his wife told him to do. I curse you, God. Now just let me die. But he comes close in kind of challenging God's justice and saying, is God really just? Does God knows what he's doing? And so when God shows up, he's somewhat responding to these parts of Job's speeches before. And he introduces Behemoth and Leviathan. And again, this is bizarre. Like, where did these things come from? And if you study, which I'm sure we all do in our spare time, other ancient Canaanite, Babylonian, and Assyrian creation myths, and their pantheons and mythologies and things like that, you'll see Behemoth and Leviathan show up. And they're basically chaos creatures from the land and sea. And chaos and disorder is terrifying in the ancient Near East because we don't know what to do with it. And so if you think back to Genesis 1 with the 7 days of creation, it's very structured and orderly, and it's very parallel. On day 1, you get light. On day 4, you get sun, moon, and stars. On day 2, you get heavens and earth. On day 5, you get birds and fish. On day 3, you get land. On day 6, you get land animals and people. It's very ordered and structured in the way it goes through. These animals and these mythic beings are terrifying. Some people, in thinking they're real creatures, think they're hippos or crocodiles. I think that's nonsense and would not have meant anything to them. But the whole point of God bringing these up is that mere humans can't tame these beasts, but the Lord Almighty can and has. Who are you, Job, to challenge me? Not only could you not do all the stuff I mentioned before, but now we're getting into the mythical realm, and I'm in charge there too. What can you do? And Job responds, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? I have uttered what I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear and I will speak. And this is, I think, him quoting himself. Hear and I will speak. I will question you and declare to me. I'd heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. I think for most people, when they get to the end of the book, feel a bit let down by God. Like God didn't answer the question or address Job with what Job needed to hear. But there's two things here I think worth mentioning. Is one, Job actually got what he asked for. He wanted an audience with God, and he got it. That's huge. Most people don't get this throughout Scripture. Job does. And he even uses language a bit more than what Moses gets to see. Moses gets to see his back. Job is kind of like, we've talked face to face, and I don't like it. And Job kind of gets this sense that God is way bigger than he thought. And so our rector at our church says all the time, it's like, I know God's ways are above my ways. His thoughts are above my thoughts. And so I trust him. But man, when I make it to heaven, I got questions. Right? And it's like, yeah, that makes tons of sense to me. I had some questions. We're running out of time, so I'll jump to the end here. The story doesn't end there, thank goodness. There is kind of a happy ending to it. God then brings the three friends to him, and he rebukes them for speaking foolishly about him, and he more or less restores everything Job had. His siblings and the rest of his family kind of come back to him. They comfort him. They give him money. And then it starts listing all the stuff that Job had before, and all the numbers are double. This is nice, right? He also brings back his doesn't bring him back. He gives him 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. And what's fascinating here is that the daughters are named. They're the most beautiful in the land. You might expect that, the culture of beauty for women is admired above everything else, perhaps. But they receive an inheritance with the sons. And that's unheard of. And this is somewhat shocking. You don't expect this, especially since none of the sons are named in the book. The 3 girls are named, none of the boys. It's fascinating. And then the book ends just by saying Job died old and full of days. He lived happily ever after. What's fascinating, though, is that there is no mention of the Satan. There's no mention of Job's wife. There's no mention of his wounds. And so all those sores that he had, it never says that he was cured of them. We could perhaps infer that, but it's not stated. God never comes back to the Satan at the end and says, see, told you so, I win the bet. It's fascinating. So what's the main message here? Is it a theodicy? I don't think so, because if it's trying to answer why bad things happen to good people, the only answer it gives is that God's making bets with Satan. That seems inadequate. I don't think that's the question it's trying to answer. So does it reinforce the retribution principle? And some people think it does with that happy ending. See, Job was faithful through it all, so God rewards him at the end. But it never says that he gets the stuff back because he was faithful. It is quite possible Job gets the stuff back because the bet's over. And so God restores him rather than rewards him. Does that make sense? So that's quite possible. So it may not reinforce the retribution principle, and I don't think it does. So what's the main message? I would go back to the wagers and ask the question, why is it that Job fears the Lord both at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book? Because I think you can say that when Job repents in dust and ashes, he returns to what he did before. He fears the Lord. He worships Yahweh. Why? Because God is God. That's it. Job returns to somebody who worships God, not because of anything he gets out of it, but because God is God. Roland Murphy, the one book I don't have with me tonight, he's the one that talks about human sincerity. But as we read throughout all of this, it's integrity is the word that was used in my translation of the Bible. Just give up your integrity, curse God, and die. Job was a man righteous and full of integrity. And that's what it comes back to. And I think that's the question for us. Handful of takeaways, and there's a lot in this book I think you can say. Be present with those who suffer and shut your mouth. And I say that to me. I mean, you know me now 2 sessions. I talk too much. Way too much. I want to fix it. Keep your mouth shut. Sit with people and weep with them. I would say respect and honor the underappreciated. One of the things the friends don't do is they don't seem to respect and honor Job. And at this point, he would be considered an outcast, somebody cursed by God and others. We should not follow him. We should stay far away from him. The other thing, too, is that the book honors and respects Job's daughters. They would have been underappreciated in their society, but the book appreciates them. I think it is totally fair to wrestle with your faith, ask questions, challenge your own assumptions, challenge other people's assumptions, but be humble in the midst of it. The one thing Job gets blasted for is for thinking too haughty of himself, that he can somehow hold God to account as he wrestles through this. You read the Psalms, they're full of laments, people questioning why, where are you, O Lord? How could you let this happen? And God seems okay with this. This is okay. Fear the Lord because God is God. I'd say that's probably the main message of the book. It takes 42 chapters to get there, but that's it. If God's God, you're not. If God's God, your mom's not. If God's God, the president's not. If God's God, whoever it is, they're not. Satan's not. Sin's not. God's God. Fear him. I'd say seek God's presence in the midst of your suffering, and this seems to be enough for Job. And then as Christians looking at this, seeing that Jesus is kind of like another Job who suffers for no reason of his own. And what's fascinating to me about Christianity is we have a God who is enfleshed in Jesus, the incarnate Christ himself, who suffers, who knows what suffering is like, and can put his arms around you and cradle you in the midst of your suffering and say, that's my boy. That's my girl. She worships me. He fears me. This is a person of integrity, and I will hold him. I will cradle her, and I know what it's like. I've been there. And I would say this is some of the stuff that you can take away from the book of Job. Good grief. I think that's all I've got. Questions, thoughts, comments? I love this book. 45 minutes or whatever we had, that's too short. I could talk about this all the time.
Job has been my go-to book when I'm feeling like Job. And but I always find it difficult to read.
Yeah.
My approach to it now will certainly be different. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. And I think it's intended to be a tough book. I mean, this is not easy stuff. I mean, if you read through the book of Job and go, boy, this is fun, you're messed up. And you're not supposed to read the suffering of somebody else and go, yay. It's supposed to hurt. It's supposed to be hard. And yet, as Ramon said from the very beginning, this oftentimes can feel closer to reality than Proverbs does.
I would put it in a few words, Stephen. God doesn't have to believe in me. God doesn't have to have that sense of hope, but I can't afford to believe without it. Therefore, it's up to me, Yeah.
Yeah, and I was talking to my spiritual director, and I know several people, especially through the pandemic, who've been like, how could a good God allow something like this to happen? And they either turn from their faith or they didn't have it beforehand and they're more hardened. And my spiritual director was like, well, what comfort do you get in that? Like knowing that there's a God kind of above our thoughts, whose ways are above our ways, kind of gives us this sense of like, this is not the way it's always going to be. And when we get to the book of wisdom, or the wisdom of Solomon at the end, it kind of puts that Proverbs hope into the eternal future and almost starts getting, and it's a Jewish book writing about eternal life. And it's fascinating when we get there and kind of says, these rewards do happen, might not be today, might not be tomorrow, but don't give up yet because it's going to come. And I would say if you ever read the book of Revelation, another, fun, fascinating read, that's kind of the message there. It's like, be faithful, have hope, because Jesus wins. Rome ain't going to win. These oppressive powers, they don't win. Jesus does. Don't give up. Wait on just a little longer.
So I wanted to know how long, like how many years was it when he started to lose things and he got things back? Was it 7?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't think it gives us a timeline. What a great question. Yeah, I don't think it gives us any kind of timeline. And even in the introductory stuffs, it's like after some time, then Job felt these afflictions. Then you have all of this stuff, and then God shows up and there's restoration. I don't think it gives a timeline at all. It would be great if it was 7 years. That would actually be wonderful, but I don't think it's got that. What a
Isn't
great
it 7 years that everybody seems to go to prison? David and everybody seems to go to prison for 7 years, which I think that was sort of the same idea of them going to prison, kind of a soul prison.
Yeah.
To test their faith.
Again, a great question that I don't know the answer to. I'm actually going to look that up. How many years people spend in prison in the Old Testament? That's fantastic. And if that's the case, that would be, just a great analogy or metaphor or whatever for exactly what you just said. You should be a biblical scholar. It's those kind of random questions that nobody else thinks about that can lead to a whole book. Anything else? Well, if you've got anything, I think all of you have my email. Please feel free to get in touch. I'd be happy to chat with you either via email or some other way. I'm having fun with this. Hope you are too. And until next week, many blessings upon you.